Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. This week on the show, I'm joined by Kyle Perry of Dreamland Wildlife Properties to answer your habitat management questions. Welcome back to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by First Light and their Camo for Conservation initiative, which supports the National Deer Association. And today, we are talking habitat management. We are continuing the habitat series this month, and my guest today is Kyle Perry. And Kyle runs a habitat management consulting and contracting company in which he and a colleague go all over the country helping folks implement their habitat management goals. He does all sorts of on-the-ground projects. He's not just a guy that gives you ideas. He actually gets out there and does the work. So he brings a lot of firsthand practitioner experience to the table. And I met Kyle first a handful of years ago, I think when he was starting to help out over on the Back 40 property, which hopefully most of you know about. Kyle has continued to help with the continued management of the Back 40, doing projects out there, and also helped me this past season with a pretty substantial habitat improvement project at my family deer camp. So today, Kyle is joining me to first walk through some of those things that we did there up at my camp, Kenroven, talk through what he thought of the property, what we accomplished, what we still could accomplish in the future, some things to think about moving forward. And then the lion's share of our conversation today is spent answering listener questions. I sent out a request for questions from you on what kinds of things you're wondering about when it comes to managing and improving habitat for deer hunting and for wildlife and all that kind of good stuff. So we got a lot of great questions to cover. We tackle a number of things around working with small properties. We tackle some questions related to how to get started down that road if you just picked up a property or if you've just decided that you want to start trying to work the land. How do you prioritize what to do first? How do you start tackling that? We talk through a good amount about natives versus invasive or non-native plants and why you might want to consider focusing on the former rather than the latter. We talk about ways to convert old fields or even yards into wildlife habitat and a whole lot more. So that's the plan for today. Kyle's a good guy. He's an up-and-comer in this space. I think he's got a bright future ahead of him, and I appreciate the perspective and the ideas he brought to our conversation today. So with that all said, let's get to my chat with Kyle Perry. All right, with me now on the line, I've got Kyle Perry. Welcome to the show, Kyle.
Thank you, Mark. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, man, I'm glad you can make it. I'm glad we're doing this. We've been talking about a podcast together for, around a year now. So glad it's come together. Every time I talk to you, though, you are usually surrounded by loud equipment sounds or trees falling down around you, or I hear the wind in the background blowing through trees. I've never once talked to you in a situation where it's quiet and you're in an office. So this is a rare occurrence, man. I didn't know that you ever spent time inside.
I generally don't like to. I really truly enjoy being in the outdoors and learning about all the wildlife and habitat improvements we can do. So
Yeah.
I'm always out there in the woods, or in the field. I truly do enjoy that. The office is not my happy place.
Yeah, man. Well, I appreciate you stepping inside the studio for a quick second to do this conversation. But what have you guys been up to this week? If you weren't in here sitting in the office talking with me, what would you be up to right now?
Well, if Mother Nature would cooperate, we'd be out forestry mulching right now, clearing out some invasive species throughout a prairie. It's a project where the property is currently enrolled in a CRP program with the NRCS.
Okay.
So we'd be removing autumn olive and honeysuckle and some multiflora rose out there with the forestry mulcher, getting that prepared for prescribed burn in the spring.
Nice. Is that kind of stuff? Well, I guess let me take a step back. You work on so many different types of work. There's a lot of guys I talk to in the habitat space that operate primarily as consultants. They walk around and they tell people, hey, you should do this. Hey, you should do this. What I found a little bit unique with you is that you're very much a practitioner. You're not just consulting. It seems like you are out in the field doing all the time.
Yes.
Like you are constantly out there doing the work, seeing the results, putting things on the landscape, and then, actually being able to say, okay, we did this, this, and this. What were the results of that? Um, can you run me down all the different types of projects and work that you in a given year might be tackling? Because it's not just like, yeah, I go out and plant some food plots. Like you are doing a lot of different things.
Yes. How long do we have to record the podcast?
Yeah. Okay, give me this in 5 minutes or less.
The 5 minute.
Yeah.
So we cover a lot of applications. We do CRP establishment, so native prairies, grasses and forbs. We do timber stand improvement work where we'll go through and mark with a forester the different tree species that need to be removed to ensure a healthy forest long term. We do facilitate timber harvest. We're the guy in between, ensuring that the timber buyer is there doing the work that he says he's going to do on site there with him, making sure the right trees are getting taken and that the landowner's getting the true value out of his timber. We work closely with U.S. Fish and Wildlife doing wetland restoration and establishment work and facilitate prescribed burns. Well, we do a lot of prescribed burns generally in the spring because most of our work is for outdoorsmen that are hunting in the fall. So we don't generally do too many burns in the fall, but we also offer food plot services. So we also cover a lot of ecosystem restoration projects where we're working with a landowner that, he wants to put in a trail system throughout the property, create a clearing or an opening for creating early successional growth. We run a lot of different applications to just ultimately create that dreamland that the landowner is inspired about.
What of all that is your favorite? If you had to pick one of these types of things that you just enjoy doing out there, what do you think that'd be?
My favorite is mulching invasive species. It's a way where you're inside a cab, generally in the heat or AC. It's relaxing. I can talk on the phone and take care of invasive species at the same time. It's
That's
pretty
pretty.
comfortable.
Yeah, that's a pretty good setup. I definitely want to talk more about the invasive species thing. We've got some listener questions surrounding that, and as you know, one of the things we're going to do here today is tackle a whole slew of questions that we got from folks who've got their own challenges, their own problems, their own situations, and they're looking for our insight. So one of those things is invasives. There's some questions around honeysuckle in particular, which you mentioned. There's some questions around why native, like why don't we want invasives out there? So I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm glad that's something you enjoy dealing with,
Yes.
because a lot of people have questions about that. Before we get to that, though, I wanted to take a little time here to talk about, the intersection of your work, the stuff you just described that you do, and my stuff, which came together. It's come together in two different ways. One, you volunteered and helped out a whole bunch over on the back 40 and have done a lot of work there on the property since we gave it to the National Deer Association. So I want to publicly thank you for the work you've done over there, helping remove invasive species. I know you've helped with the food plot planting. Have you guys drilled grass? Have you been on the drill helping them with switchgrass, or did they just frost seed switchgrass?
No, we did in the spring, I think 2022, somewhere in there. The years fly by when you're having fun. But
Hmm.
somewhere, I believe in the spring of 2022, we interseeded switchgrass with the Great Plains drill throughout the prairie.
Okay, nice. So you did switch, you did work on the honey hole prairie
My favorite
restoration
spot.
unit there. Yep, that's a pretty awesome spot. And then the food plots. And I got to tell you, man, I went back there and helped mentor hunters last fall again and got to see it. And it is just so night and day compared to when I started there in 2019, I guess it would have been was our first year. It is transformed. It's really incredible. There was almost half of the farm when we started that was like a wildlife desert. It was just very thin, weedy, invasive stuff that was providing no food, no cover. It was just like desolate. And now there's nothing like that. Every inch of that property is wildlife habitat. It is quality cover. There's so much diversity. There's the grasses, there's the food plots, there's trees, there's native prairie. There's still some invasives because that property was full of them, but there's much larger sections where that's been improved upon. It's just exciting to see. So kudos to you for helping out there and doing some good stuff. And you're like the equipment and the skill you bring to the table helps so much to go from like what one of us could do with our hands and a shovel versus what you can do with a skid steer or a forestry mulcher or a drill. And I definitely saw that in the second place that we worked together, which was up at my family deer camp, the place we call Kenroven. Last year, you joined me up at the family cabin in the, I don't know, February or March timeframe. I think it was maybe April. I don't know, somewhere in that ballpark.
I think
And
it was around April. It was
yeah,
just thawing out.
yeah. So we were up there and I had some goals that I had talked to you about, mostly being the fact that we have this 40-acre property, which was mostly all timbered now. There used to be old fields scattered with some timber, some young forest, and then some swamp. And over the last, 30 some years that my family's had the property, it's almost entirely now mature forest. And so a handful of years ago, we started trying to chip away at that a little bit and create a couple little openings, but we were doing this by hand. Me and my dad don't have a lot of experience with that kind of thing, trying to fall big trees or anything like that. So it was limited what we were able to achieve. And so I reached out to you and said, hey, man, I'm wanting to take this to the next level. You guys seem to have that kind of experience. Can you come and help me do that? Create some big openings, create expanded food plots, maybe create some wildlife openings or some new bedding habitat, different things like that. And so I had a general idea of what I thought I wanted. You and I talked about that ahead of time. And then we met up there at the property together, walked it, talked through all these things, showed you the landscape, and then said, hey, can you do it? Or what can you do? So can you walk me through, from your perspective, like your assessment of the property after I showed it to you, after you looked at the maps, after you looked at it, what did you think was needed? And then B, can you talk me through and talk everyone listening through, what you were able to do and what you thought about that?
Yeah, so we drove in. We started at the beginning part of the property. Again, I thank you for the opportunity to work with you and your dad on the property up north. Very special opportunity. Um, Initially, when I drove in there, I was kind of looking at the access. Access is very key when evaluating a property, especially up north. You have a lot of surrounding forests, so it makes it kind of an even playing field when it comes to the ecosystem. Down south we have the fence rows and prairies and a little more diverse habitat. So first off, I was looking at access. We walked down the southern part of the property border, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of got into an area of big, big conifers, very wide open. You could see for approximately probably 100 to 150 yards through the timber there. So initially, my thought was creating some early successional pockets that coincide with bedding for deer and also areas for grouse. I thought that was a key important part of the establishment of the property there. So looking at early successional, creating some trail systems for access. I was listening to you and your dad kind of talk about how you hunted the property previously, what you wanted to do moving forward while we had the equipment there to accomplish those tasks. So overall, I thought the property was very cool. It offered some unique diversity. My favorite part was how the clearing was right in the center part of the property. So to access from different winds was excellent. You could come in there from a southwest wind, prevailing winds, get in there on the property from the north side there and hunt that real easily. So walking through there, we kind of looked at trail systems. We identified a key area to open up like a wildlife corridor, which um, which coincided with the pockets that we put into getting lost on the direction up there. I think the clearing was to our east where we established those early successional areas. And then we opened up that wildlife corridor for a supplemental food source with a food
Mm-hmm.
plot that then tied into a big open field that you and your dad had already started clearing. Approximately a quarter acre, I think we mapped out on using on X maps there. So walking through there, I knew that needed to be expanded. I felt that the property was somewhat lacking supplemental food sources, like a good established food plot. So immediately, our you and I talked about that. I expressed my importance of clearing that out and making it a little bit bigger. So we went ahead and outlined that and started clearing the area, cutting the larger trees down, the non-desirables, leaving behind the oaks for scrapes and regeneration of hardwoods, and took the brush and what was left over from the forestry mulcher and kind of pushed it around the edge and created some pockets for rabbits and other nesting species.
Yeah.
Then we walked across my favorite part of the property, the bridge that leads to the cabin. So
Mm-hmm.
we didn't really do too much over there. I think we ran out of time, but that helped me kind of tie the whole big picture together of the access from the north part of the property coming in from the east edge. So that really helped kind of put tie everything together and understand how do we improve this property and make it better for you and your dad for accessibility and overall use.
Yeah. Well, it was amazing what you were able to get done in 2 days compared to what we had done in years of dabbling with things. I mean, you and I think your brother was helping. Um,
Yes.
you guys are good with the chainsaw. You're good with the good with the forestry mulcher. And man, I mean, you took what was like a eighth acre or quarter acre little opening I had and expanded it to almost an acre. You create another like eighth acre ish, maybe a little bit bigger plot in the middle of the timber. You created 3 or 4 more of these kind of pockets where we cut down a bunch of trees, left treetops down, which I'm hoping is going to lead to more early successional, growth happening there now. Because it used to be, like you said, this wide open, mature conifer stand that was just like a wildlife desert. Nothing hardly passed through there. Nothing spent time in there. Now you've got 3 or 4 of these thick pockets where there's sunlight getting to the ground, and then you have that internal food plot too. And like you talked about with pushing all the brush to the side, creating brush piles, but then also kind of treetop barriers along edges of the food plot too. That, when my dad and I started looking at that after you guys were all done, we started, and you and I talked about this too, like how do we strategically use these to set up hunting locations? And so that's what we
Yes.
did. We came in there and we put 2 really nice ground blinds for my dad on either side of that main food plot system, one on the south side, one on the north side, so that, if we had a southerly type wind, southwest, west, southwest, something like that, he could hunt the one. And then flip side, if we got like a northwest, north, northeast, anything like that, you could hunt the other one. And had really good access routes planned to both of those. With all that down tree cover, we're able to kind of push these blinds into that thicket created by these barriers and just perfectly hid the ground blinds in there. And then there's no way deer would be, at least not close to the blind, getting downwind because they have to go way
Yes.
around these barriers.
Excellent.
So it looked great. We came in there after you left, and I first top seeded rye to try to get something started in the spring. And then I came back in the fall, or not fall, late summer, I guess, and uh, broadcast kind of a blend of grains and brassicas and clover and a whole different series of things. Um, and that came in pretty decent. Not perfect, but decent. We did a little more top seeding of rye in September, I think. But surprisingly, the small food plot deep in the timber maybe did the best. That thing came in really nicely, which we were a little worried about with sunlight or not.
Yeah.
But you did
Wow.
you did position it so that it was running north south, so you would get as much possible sun as you could coming in there through the south, and that worked. Um, so that ended up being pretty lush green carpet inside the timber, and it was tight to the neighbors there, where the neighbor had done a clear cut maybe 5 to 8 years ago, maybe 7 to 10 years, something like that. And so the neighbors got really nice early successional habitat on their place. So there's a lot of deer spending time in there. And so we ended up seeing a lot of deer coming out of there and hitting our little food plot. Um,
Awesome.
and so the grand reveal, a lot of folks have wondered, how did things go? How did the work translate into deer activity, into hunting success, that kind of stuff. Um, I've got a film coming out this fall that breaks down how my dad's hunt, the two of us, how that went. I won't tell you guys the specifics of that yet, but I will tell you that we had better deer activity on trail camera than ever before, by far. I
Yes.
do think that some of the deer numbers went down a little bit earlier than I would have hoped, and I attribute that to just the food plot um, quality just wasn't what it needs to be. I've got to keep on working on improving that soil quality, and I do think that we the thing that came in the best was rye. And so
Okay.
we had a lot of rye, and that was super attractive early. But then I think as that matured, right, it becomes a little bit less attractive later in the season.
Yes.
And so I'm going to be rethinking or just thinking about how I can improve what we're planting this coming year. But all that said, with the new pockets, with the larger food plot, with the second food plot, I bet you we had at least 4 bucks on camera. Yeah.
Or
Well, at least 4 bucks, and not just bucks. I'm saying at least 4 bucks that were 3 or older, maybe
wow.
4 or older. I mean, we've never had mature bucks like that. We have maybe since we did the first little food plot, we would get like one nice buck a year, maybe that passed through in the fall. This year there was 4, and there were 2. Yeah, I think there's 4 bucks that were probably 4 or older, and 2 of them were absolute gaggers. I mean, 2 bucks that I would be thrilled to shoot down in southern Michigan.
That's
Um,
exciting.
like 130 inch, 140 inch type bucks, like really nice deer. So there were a lot of bucks in the area passing through in that pre-rut to rut time frame. They stuck around. They continued to visit it consistently. Um, I'll tell you one thing. Well, no, I won't. I'll save the specifics of buck stuff for the film, I suppose. But in short, we saw progress. It was exciting, and I'm excited about that. But all that said, there seems like there's so much more to do. Like I want to continue to improve it. So
Absolutely.
with all that said, and with what you saw there, what would be like 1 or 2 things you would recommend I think about moving forward as far as next steps or the next project to work on or the next thing to improve, given what you saw?
The next thing that we didn't get to really touch on too much was that creek that runs to the north of the food plot. That kind of, I believe it runs on a, I'm going off memory. It's been a year now, almost. I believe that runs northwest to southeast, if I'm correct there.
Mostly east west.
East west. I think we kind of touched on while we were there the first time of creating some travel corridors through there and enhancing some of those areas along there to create some bedding and open pockets for the wildlife.
Okay.
And that would be if it runs east west, that would be on the north side of that creek,
Yep.
kind of just directly behind the cabin.
Yep.
So going in there
Yeah.
and kind of doing some TSI, trying to improve. That's where I seen or noticed a lot of the hardwoods. So trying to enhance some of the regeneration of the hardwoods and open those areas up for sunlight, and create more browse.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the kind of place on the neighbors where they did that in the hardwoods that they have, and it seemed to have made a difference. So I could see that being useful on our side of the line, on the north side. So
Definitely.
I
Yeah, and kind
think
of
you're on something.
replaying the tape a little bit. We had when we first walked into the property on the south side, we were talking about the neighbors, the early successional growth, and that's kind of how we came to the conclusion that we should tie in that trail system food plot running north and south to connect that early succession to the movement of your new destination food plot.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm glad to hear that all tied in real nice.
Yeah. It's on its way. So that's exciting.
Excellent.
So much to do though. So much to
There
do, so
always
little
is a
time.
lot to do. The best part about this is the work never ends. You keep coming
Hmm.
up with new things, maintaining those trails, ensuring that those food plots are staying healthy, doing soil tests. I generally do those every year, depending on the soil type. You could get away with every other year, but generally up north, I try to do one every year to kind of monitor that soil health and ensure a good, strong, healthy food plot.
Yeah. Well, with that in mind, and with my wheels spinning as I'm thinking about what I need to be tackling next in the coming months, let's get to the important stuff, which is answering the people's questions. So often I selfishly ask all the questions on these things, but every once in a while I remember, hey, I should actually see what the listeners want to cover. So I thought that would be how we spend the rest of our time. I got a bunch of different questions from folks. So I want to get your perspective on some of this stuff, and then I thought I'd throw in my ideas as well.
Yes.
I've got obviously not as much experience as you have, but I have experience as a land manager myself in several different places, and can bring that side of things to the table. So you down for that?
I am absolutely down for that.
All right.
Always enjoy
So
answering questions.
yeah. So the first question is from a new landowner. He describes himself as a new, overwhelmed landowner. And he just wants to know what our advice is for developing a priority list and figuring out where to start on a new property that you want to improve for wildlife and for hunting. Um, what would be a couple things you would recommend for someone who's just trying to start to prioritize, like how to get this thing started?
So the first thing I generally prioritize is if he bought that property this year, I would at least hunt it for 1 year. Kind of do a lot of analysis. Write down what you're seeing, where you're sitting, different winds that you hunted with in different areas. Just overall learn that property. Spend time there in the off season, during the season, and just become a student of the property. Learn that piece and analyze it. I can't say that enough. Analyze it, analyze, analyze. And then from there, after that first year or maybe 2 years, depending on how much time you got to spend there, break down, all that knowledge that you collected and create a game plan. Um, my first thing I always look for is how do you access a property? Access is key to keep pressure off the wildlife.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Another thing I'd be thinking about too, and I like your point about learning, right? Like you don't need to rush into this. Let's just focus on like figuring out what's our baseline? What are we starting with here? A really important part of that is to not just look at what's on your property, but also look what's in the neighborhood. So kind of zoom out and, literally you can zoom out by looking at an aerial map and zoom out, or, just drive around the neighborhood, or when you're hunting your place or when you're out exploring your place, look at what's on the neighbors. What are they doing over there? What do they have? Look on your map, see what kind of habitat is over there. Drive around the back roads. Watch, as you drive by and see, okay, what kind of habitat's here? Is there lots and lots of food? Is there lots and lots of cover? Is there water around anywhere? Is there, anything that's operating as a sanctuary, or is everything getting hunted by all my neighbors? Try to figure out like what's the whole? Like what's the missing link? What's the rare thing around here?
Yes.
Oftentimes, if you can figure out what is rare, what's missing, what's the thing that deer want that's not readily available in the area, if you focus there first, if you provide the thing that's missing everywhere else, you can start to have a disproportionately positive impact on your whole region. So, an example of that would be if you are in an area that's got tons and tons of agriculture. It's just like, let's say it's like northern Ohio or something like that, where there's just lots of open farmland and you have, let's say, 40 acres, and you're thinking, well, I want food plots and I want food and stuff. And so if you go that route, well, you're kind of adding more of the same. But if
Yeah.
you sit and you see like all your neighbors are wide open farm fields, and you instead decide to add cover to your property, all of a sudden you become the only cover in town. And that has a huge impact then. So that's one thing to think about. That's not always the thing you want to do first, but I think it's an important thing to think about, and
Sure.
that can help you set priorities. Um, those kind of lowest holes in the bucket where the water's leaking out, if you think of like that metaphor, you got to plug that hole first before you can fill it up the rest of the way. And
Absolutely.
that's a thing to be considering early on. I think another thing to your point of like analysis, run trail cameras a lot to get a sense of what deer are doing and how they're doing it. Do your soil tests like you talked about. Um, Even go out there with like the Seek app or different things like that and start identifying like what are the plants here? What native species do I have? What invasive species do I have? Just start building that baseline understanding of what's here. And then, that leads to the ability to the next year start saying, okay, here's what I have. Here's what I don't have. Here's what's missing. These are my goals. And then you can have like an educated plan versus just
Yes.
willy-nilly throwing darts at a wall,
Yeah, a lot of guys I've noticed they'll want to everyone's excited. You buy that piece of property, you want to get out there, you want to start doing habitat work. And that is a big mistake in my opinion. You want to stay, you want to analyze, learn that property. To talk on your point a little further is meet the neighbors. Maybe as you're driving around, meet those neighbors, kind of see, are they warm, welcoming to talking and seeing how you guys could collaborate and maybe create connecting habitat between both parcels and work together. I think that's another key approach is meeting the neighbors and trying to get on the same page, because we always know that we buy 40 acres and then the next 40 acres comes up for sale. You want to buy that. So you're always trying to expand and grow bigger. Well, capital could be an issue. So if you meet the neighbors, you can uh, extend your property in a sense because you're working together and you're
Yeah.
both creating better habitat.
Yeah. Good point. There's another question from somebody else that's very closely related to this. They just asked about what some realistic first year goals could be. But if we're saying like, hey, the first year you might not want to do any real big projects, you just want to learn. So let's fast forward to now our first year of like actively doing stuff. We've had time to assess the situation. We've had time to learn the property, meet our neighbors, do some of this baseline setting. Now it's like time to get your hands dirty. You've got your first year ahead of you of doing work. Like you said, we all want to like change the world in a day.
Yes.
What would be a realistic goal or two or set of goals for that first year of work? What kind of things or what level of work do you think is reasonable to expect in year one of that?
Depending on the composition of the property, say you have a 60 acre nice mature hardwoods area, I generally like to start with logging. That puts money in the landowner's pocket, and that can also set forward the improvement of the land. So creating some more of that early succession, uh, encouraging additional browse. Before you do a timber harvest, though, you want to make sure you're analyzing invasive species. So if I was to say start with number one, analyze invasive species, use different plant apps to ID invasive species, because you could go on there and log that woods, and next thing you know, you got a forest floor of honeysuckle, which is a whole nother battle that most of us don't want to get into unless you have heavy equipment. It can be a job, and so I would say manage invasive species, learn and identify those. And then I generally really truly like to start with a timber harvest, get some of that mature timber down, create some early successional growth, and increase that browse and side cover for all wildlife. And generally that starts everything on a good foot.
Yeah. This perfectly ties into another question and a large topic. But someone asked, just for our thoughts on managing for native habitat and why that's important versus, just letting what's out there do its thing, letting the
Yes.
invasives go. Can you give me what's your pitch to somebody on why trying to promote native vegetation versus invasives is worthwhile? Why is that important in your view?
Well, natives certainly are more desirable for the wildlife, all wildlife, not just deer. We have turkeys that use the insects that feed off those native plants, the butterflies that use those flowers that pollinate certain tree species that we spend time planting, your apples and pears, your bees. Everything is really, in a sense, in the ecosystem working together. So the more you can encourage your micro ecosystem, call it, on your parcel of property, the more you can manage that in a native way, everything generally works together. And it's much more desirable for the wildlife. Invasive species are invasive for a reason. They can overtake the native habitat and completely change the landscape quicker than man can with mechanical tools or by hand.
Yeah.
So making sure that you're identifying those native species and taking care of them is very important. And
Yeah.
also, going into the local NRCS office and utilizing the resources there that at our all of our fingertips, learning those species, seeing what programs are available to encourage native habitat and also manage the invasive species.
Yeah. Are there government programs that will help fund dealing with invasives or can get you assistance to come out there and help remove some of that stuff or manage that? Is that anything that you've looked into that's available?
Yes, and it does vary across county, but I would recommend any landowner go into their local NRCS office, FSA office, and talk with the staff there and see what programs are available for their area and different in property. Because, for instance, our Hillsdale farm has a lot of desire for the copper belly water snake, which is an endangered snake here in southern Michigan. So we've utilized some of the money available to encourage better habitat for the copper belly water snake. We've added wetlands on our property.
Hmm, very cool.
So
So,
that funding comes from some of that from some of those endangered species as well to
yeah,
help promote good habitat.
yeah, that's great. I read a book recently called Nature's Best Hope by Doug Tallamy, I think is his last name. And it was one of the best things I've read to help me just understand the importance of the native vegetation and how much more beneficial that is than the invasives. And
Yes.
and what he really emphasized and what makes a lot of sense is that the health of an ecosystem and the productivity of an ecosystem, so like how much wildlife your back 40 can produce, it's all dependent on the interactions between all the different species. And so you've got plants that deer depend on, right? So if you want a lot of deer and if you want big deer or whatever it is, or if you want a lot of grouse or if you want turkeys, you need the right vegetation, and you also need the right insects, because insects are providing food for many of those bug species that are pollinating the plants, propagating them, continuing them to grow. And so if you want the turkeys, if you want the grouse, you need all that kind of stuff too. And so what he emphasized, that you need to look at each different layer of the food chain of the network. And
Yeah.
there are many specialist relationships within an ecosystem between insects and plants, or pollinators and plants. And what you have when you have invasives come in is you have invasive plants that take over an ecosystem that insects do not have a relationship with. And so you'll have a whole bunch of plant life that a whole bunch of the native insects can't feed on or can't pollinate, can't interact with. And
Yeah.
so you lose a lot of those insects that are important prey species for all sorts of birds. They're important prey for turkeys. They're important prey for all sorts of stuff. And then that causes this trickle down effect. So if you want to have a lot of caterpillars and a lot of insects and all the stuff that all your birds want to eat, and that are then going to continue pollinating the right things in your area, you need to have the native stuff that these species have evolved alongside of. And
Yes.
so that's why when you get a whole bunch of honeysuckle or you get a whole bunch of autumn olive or whatever it is, and you think like, oh, that looks like good deer cover. um, well, it might be in the short term, but that is negatively impacting everything else, that in the long run negatively impacts your deer herd and all the other birds and species out there.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think I think it's important to try to emphasize the native vegetation as much as possible, to not introduce something that's invasive and non-native. Um, Great point on connecting with the NRCS on government programs. Another thing, I think there was a question here. Oh, yeah, there was a question from someone asking how to find information about the best native plants for your area. I'm curious what your answer to that would be if you have any other ideas. But there is one resource I found called the Native Plant Finder. It's a program by the National Wildlife Federation, and the link is nativeplantfinder.nwf.org. If you
That's a
go to
great.
that website, you
Yes.
punch in your zip code for wherever your property is, and it will show you the top flowers, the top grasses, the top trees and shrubs as far as native plants for your area that support insect life and all the other stuff that depends on it. So if you do that, you're getting all the other benefits. So like something like oaks are a top native in my area, of course, many places.
Yes.
And they're great, as we all know, because they produce mast, but they also are one of the most important um, trees for producing and housing insects. They're one of the very most important places for caterpillar production, which caterpillars feed the lion's share of birds at certain times of the year. So super important for all sorts of reasons. So oaks are a big one. By me, goldenrod's really good. Sunflower is really good. Lupine, violet, geranium, um, willows, beach plums, cherries, birch, aspen, maple, box elder, all sorts of stuff. You can go to that website, plug in your zip code, get some recommendations there. You mentioned the NRCS office in your neck of the woods. Is there any other resource you'd recommend for folks to go to start getting some of this information?
I haven't found any valid other, resources other than the NRCS FSA office. You could generally reach out and try to find different groups, that are focused on native ecosystem restoration projects in your area. Be a great learning resource. But I would say that the best recommendation from myself would be your NRCS. They're local. They're very educated on the native plant species in that specific ecosystem within that county. And I think getting as close down to the area that you're in with your native plant communities is very key because you could say Michigan natives, and that's a large area versus zeroing it down right into your local county area is the best for ecosystem management.
Yeah. One more on this line of thinking. Somebody asked, in what situation would you consider honeysuckle good or bad for deer? Um, is there any situation in which you would say it's good?
This is a tough question. I would say honeysuckle is good for deer when it's anywhere from 8 inches to 2 feet tall, where they can browse that and eat that new growth because it does leaf out before any other plant or shrub, and as well as it loses its leaves last. So it's great from that point. It's nutritional. It does provide some. Autumn olive does provide nitrogen into the soil, so it is a nitrogen fixator. But there's not too many pros of it. If you could mulch that down and manage it in a way that it doesn't get over 3 to 4 foot tall, where it starts getting above uh, the deer where they can reach to browse, I would say anywhere lower than that is beneficial. As soon as it gets to that 8 to 10 foot range, plants underneath start to die off, and the diversity is then lost.
Yeah. And is that the big knock, like the big reason honeysuckle is such an issue is because it can so quickly take over an area that it can just completely push out all of the native stuff that's really good for all sorts of things for long periods of time, and then it then matures the way you're talking about and then eliminates all value. Is that the big issue?
Yes, well, and you were mentioning the importance of birds, and birds love honeysuckle berries. So as soon as that bird eats that berry, it goes and sits on that limb of the oak tree and decimates down, and there's an opening in the canopy for sunlight to hit that honeysuckle is sprouting, and as soon as that takes off and starts to grow and gets mature, everything underneath the diversity is completely lost. So it
Yeah.
is very important from a management perspective to make sure that you are either eradicating it or managing it in a way that it's still beneficial for the wildlife.
Okay. Speaking of birds, got a question here about turkeys. Um, you've probably been seeing the same reports I have over recent years about declining turkey numbers in certain parts of the country. There seems to be this rising concern about what for a long time was a smashing success of a wildlife restoration story when it comes to bringing turkeys back, and now all of a sudden, like people are like, ugh, we're worried again about it.
Yeah.
So someone here asked, what can we do that helps deer but also greatly benefits declining turkey populations? Is that something you've got any ideas around? Are there any specific projects or types of work that you think would be particularly useful to help turkeys too?
Yes, absolutely. Using those chainsaws, getting out there, doing timber stand improvement, um, also logging. Logging is a great way to create some of that side cover for those birds to get up under those tops post logging and nest. So having that side cover and brushy ecosystem is key for turkeys as well as other wildlife, deer in particular. Having that early successional growth is very valuable for turkeys and side cover to reduce the amount of predation on those young poults.
Yeah. Yeah, I looked into this last year for a writing project and was trying to understand, where are the real challenges for turkeys, what's the issue, and most everything, the biggest culprit was a reduction in nesting and brooding habitat. Just like you mentioned, we really
Yeah,
need to have that quality nesting and brooding habitat, which is like early successional growth, 3 feet or lower, grasses, shrubs, forbs. Um, you need that kind of safe area, and then also productive, insect population, insect growth. And then finally, an important thing that I read a couple places was that when it comes to turkeys, having multiple regions like this is beneficial versus having just like one pocket. So if you've got 40 acres, it would be better to have, at least according to these sources that I read, it would be better to have multiple pockets of this kind of habitat, like 4 or 5 half-acre zones like this or an acre zone like this, versus just one, because you would have predators zeroing in on just that one location all the time and being able to sweep it clean and
yes.
pick up those poults versus having that spread out across your property. So, multiple areas of early successional habitat that give you that brooding and nesting habitat seems to be a good thing for turkeys.
Diversity to diversity, diversity.
Yeah, that
And,
is.
and spreading out those areas of early succession. Like you said, that's some of the concern is you see guys will go out and they'll clear cut a whole area, of their property, and that's the only thing that wildlife uses is that one particular area. So you got to have certain pockets of different management techniques to help ensure the health of wildlife.
Mhm.
Having areas where it's not too dense on the forest floor that they can feed on those acorns versus not find those, and those are definitely key points.
Yeah. Here's a unique one. This guy says, I just bought a home on 14 acres. There's about 8 acres of woods and 6 acres of yard with a pond. I'd like to add a food plot or some kind of wildlife holding habitat to my grass acreage. What would our suggestions be for turning some portion of that 6 acre yard into better wildlife habitat? What would you do with a big yard, Kyle?
Well, I don't like to spend time on the lawnmower, so I would most likely kill off that grass that's currently existing and plant either some grasses and forbs to create some of that again early successional habitat, some trees, shrubs creating that cover, as well as forage at different times of the year, and really analyzing because that 8 acres of woods is key. Depending on his location, if he has surrounding habitat, it might not be as key, but if he has fields surrounding him, staying out of that woods and really making it desirable for wildlife is key to hold those on your property. If you can
Yeah.
go in there and leave that area alone, um, cut some of those non-desirable trees out of there or shrubs, add more browse to the forest floor, and then keeping that area low pressure, and then adding in the diversity throughout the yard. That probably that would be my approach to that property without knowing the surrounding area.
What does that look like? Like like walk me through the actual process of killing the yard and planting this blend of grasses, forbs, whatever other stuff you would do. Like, how does the guy do that?
Well, step one would be killing the grass. If you're opposed to the chemical use, you could till multiple times and then call a pack and then I highly recommend no-till drilling in the natives. That gets your best seed to soil contact. You could broadcast, but it's very difficult when you add a mix of forbs into that native plant community. So the forbs are more of a fluffy seed, so it's very hard to get those to run through, like for instance, an earthway spreader. So that's why I always recommend, no-till drilling if you can. Back to those NRCS offices, they generally have a drill there that you can rent if you have a tractor or other equipment to pull that. So either spraying that grass and killing it, or tilling it multiple times to break up that root system, and then no-till drilling in the native grasses and forbs. If you were to just plant, say for instance, switchgrass, a lot of guys like switchgrass for cover in smaller areas because it grows tall and it stands real well when it comes to heavy wet snow here in the Midwest. So that you could call pack once and then broadcast the seed and then call pack again. That way you're ensuring that that switchgrass seed isn't getting too deep in the soil.
Okay. Yeah, I like that idea. And that would definitely be along the lines of what I'd be thinking of doing too. I think I would, so he has a 6 acre yard. And so we'll say like the front acre is around his house. So we'll let him keep that. So now he's got 5 acres to work with. And he wants to make this, I'm assuming he wants to be able to hunt this place too, right? And so I would say the only other thing I might suggest is you can have a food plot in there, have your acre food plot or whatever, half acre food plot, but strategically place that in a location where you can access it without spooking deer, and then also be able to get out of it. If you want to hunt the edge of that food plot for an evening hunt, make sure that you're setting it up in such a way that you can exit heading back towards the house without having to spook deer, and or be able to hunt your timber without spooking deer feeding on the food plot. So thinking about your access when you place that food plot, and
Yes.
then the rest of it would be what you just described. I would plant that prairie, native grass, forbs, flowers, whatever, get that. That's going to get us the early successional habitat that deer want, that turkeys want, that all the birds and critters want. And then using something like you mentioned, switchgrass, or to help me get by in year one, maybe I would do something like a sorghum or something to create a screen. Because the one thing I would be worried about in a yard situation is like, how do I make sure that deer feel safe coming out and feeding or hanging out here in the daylight
Yes.
without being spooked by whatever I'm doing or my kids are doing behind the house or whatever. So I would try to create some kind of screen to block off the house or neighbors from, these wildlife attracting spots. So the long-term solution would be like a switchgrass screen, or some kind of native grass screen if you can find one that will be tall and hold up well, or plant conifers if you can find something like that. Um, I know there are some willow species that can grow very quickly and create a visual screen. That could be something to think about. But I'd be thinking about how can I screen. So what I imagine is somehow screening the food plot or screening the main area that I want to be able to hunt from the house, and then inside of that screen is where I want my prairie and my native grasses and all that stuff. And then you can have your food plot tucked in there that gives you your little attraction point. And then you've got your timber behind that could be your main bedding area or whatever. And so you've got these layers of habitat. You've got this diversity of habitat. But most important, I think, is like providing a sense of security for them.
Very,
Um,
very good point.
I think
Security.
I think that helps.
Yes. Yeah, and
Um,
and back to the food plots, when I'm designing a property layout, I always try to keep in mind that I'm improving the habitat to the point where those food plots are simply supplemental food sources. The deer and
yeah,
wildlife are only using those when they absolutely need it, and they also can depend on those for different times of the year when things get tough, whether it's super cold, the snow gets deep, or it could be dry at different points of the year.
yeah. All right, so Kyle, I've got another follow-up question that's similar to that. Someone had asked about the best method for restoring or reforesting an old hayfield or pasture. Basically how to add cover to an old field. Would you have basically the same answer as to what we just said somebody should do with a yard, or is there something different we could do in this old field type situation?
Yeah, I would take a little different approach. The local NRCS office um, could potentially cover some of the costs of the reestablishment of that old pasture. If there's invasive species out there, they could um, help give you some money to subsidize the cost of remediation work, whether it's removing those invasive species or establishing that prairie. They generally will help subsidize the cost of the reestablishment of prairie in those areas that have been used for agriculture previously.
Hmm. Okay. Do you think that there's any value to, in the last question, we talked about, planting native grasses, forbs, all that kind of stuff to try to transform the yard into something useful. One thing I thought with like an old field situation is that you might not want to rush into planting something because there might still be native seeds in the seed bank. If you were to just, disturb the pasture by disking it or spraying it or burning it, and then just seeing what's in the seed bank, see what naturally comes up, and you might actually get some good native growth that you want that would achieve this stuff for you. And then all you have to do is spot treat a few invasives here and there, plant some trees wherever you want it. But that might be a cheaper way to kind of use what nature's already given you. Um, I recognize in some cases you might do that, and then it's all nasty, non-native stuff that you don't want. So it's a hit or miss. But is that a
Yes.
reasonable possibility to do in this
Oh,
situation?
absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way of kind of reclaiming that old pasture. One thing I would recommend in conjunction with that is getting on Google Earth and going back to the earliest aerial imagery of that area and kind of playing that tape forward to see if you can recognize any remnants of native prairie throughout the time. Depending on some of the maps, you can go as far back as the 1950s and replay that all the way to the current day.
Hmm,
So that would give
that's
you a good
interesting.
idea of whether there's potential for existing native prairie um, in that old pasture area.
That's a cool idea. Um, okay. Here's a question that I can relate to. I have this situation up at our northern Michigan deer camp, actually. The question is, I can hold does on our property year round, but bucks only seem to come around during the pre-rut. What can I do to get bucks to spend time on my property all year round versus just for that little window? What do you think, Kyle?
That's a tough one. It's one that could, be answered in a few different ways. It could be one too many does. The does could be congregated in the desirable areas of habitat on the property. Does generally like that healthier ecosystem. They need that nutrition for feeding the young and taking care of the new fawns for the spring. So they need a lot of nutrition. The does generally gravitate towards better habitat from what I've analyzed. Um, and also, it could be a back to too many does. If you have too many does, it will push out those bucks and cause them to go stay on different properties throughout times of the year. Obviously during the rut, you're going to have those bucks in there chasing after those does because they're commingling at that point. So that would say, I'd answer that in two different ways. Either too many does or that the ecosystem is improved in small areas, and that means you could probably go through the rest of the property and improve that to help spread out that populations of does and create less density in different areas.
Hmm. Yeah, so I thought about it in two ways, and kind of similar to you. I think that one of the things that absolutely could be would be the too many does. In that, like, bucks, especially mature bucks, are like grumpy old men. They want space, they want to be left alone, they want to feel safe and comfortable in their old routine, and they need to have safe, secure bedding areas where they can, get those things achieved. So if you've got a place that's just overran with does in every nook and cranny, and there's not a lot of good security cover and bedding opportunities, a mature buck just might not like to spend very much time there.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing. So I guess there's three ways you could do this. One, reduce the deer density if you're in a place like that where it's just like tons and tons of deer. Um, you know, Jeff Sturgis likes to call us a doe factory. So if you were just
Yes, it
pumping out
does.
does all year round, maybe you need to reduce the doe density some so that you open up more of these areas for bucks to live the life they want to live. Secondly, you could increase your bedding cover. Maybe it's just the fact that you don't have a lot of good security bedding cover. And if you were to increase that, then maybe you can create these spaces where a buck will feel safe, will feel comfortable, will have the separation from the rest of the herd that he wants. So that could help. And then finally, you know, the second attraction of a habitat or of a property is there the food that bucks are going to want. And so if you have a property that just, you know, and I guess if you've got does, then you have your basic criteria met from a deer attraction standpoint because there are does hanging out there feeding. But what I'm thinking here is like, for example, up in at Kenrub at our deer camp, prior to doing the work we had, and even now, still to a degree, we have some food, we have lots of cover, although it's not like perfect cover, but we have lots of cover, a little bit of food, and it's been enough that we can get does to hang out there consistently, but the bucks are not there consistently yet. And I think that's because like there's just not enough to go around. And so the only time they really are willing to come onto this still subpar property that's like just not quite right yet is they're willing to do that during the rut because there are females there. And so that's a starting point. But until like there's lots of food and lots of cover, I don't necessarily see them taking up shop there year round. So I kind of think about this as like oh, I don't know. It's like a bad analogy, but like a really cruddy bar. Um, if there's a really cruddy bar and I'm a college student, I might be willing to go to the really cruddy bar at 3 a.m. when I'm, trolling and trying to meet a gal. But like,
Yeah.
I'm not going to go to the really cruddy bar at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock and spend 4 hours there just hanging out with my buddies because it's not that much fun. There's not that
Yeah.
much good stuff there. I'm only going to go there when I'm desperate at the end of the night and I've had a couple beers, right? So that's kind of
Yeah.
what I'm imagining our property might be for deer right now. When they're desperate, when it's the rut and they're just looking for anything anywhere, they're willing to come over there and hang out. I need to transform my property into like the really nice place where people want to start the day and end the day. I'm not quite there. It's a work in progress still. And I'm imagining that could be a scenario which you could see this kind of thing happening.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I was actually thinking as you were talking, I kind of use this reference many times during consultations is you want to treat your property kind of like a hotel. You have a pool where everyone will congregate. All the families will come down there. They'll swim for the afternoon. 7, 8 o'clock rolls around. You have that mom and dad and 2 kids that go back to their hotel room. Generally is on the first or second floor, depending on the hotel type. And then you get those private suites where it might be a mom and dad's night out, and you're just alone, and you want that higher quality sleep, not as much noise. So you're on the top floor. That kind of goes to that mature buck bed. He wants that area where not getting disturbed. He can be to himself. And then those does are where the families are at. They're in the more congested areas where they're closer to the food, they're closer to the pool. They're kind of closer to everything because they're nursing those young, they're keeping them protected, and they want to be close so that way they're not spending a lot of energy getting to and from food sources and taking care of the young. As we all know, taking care of kids requires more energy, so that means they need to be closer to the food and good cover to reduce the predation on those young fawns.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like we're knocking the metaphors out of the park right here. So I think it's a good place to wrap it up as we've hit our sweet spot of of literary metaphors and whatnot. So with that said, Kyle, good stuff. We tackled some good questions here. I appreciate you helping out with this. Thanks for taking the time today. Thank you for the help up at our place up north. We're excited about the progress we're seeing there and owe a lot of that to you. So thank you. All right, and that's going to do it today. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for tuning in. If you're a habitat guy or girl, I hope you get out there and enjoy these coming weeks and months of habitat season, improving early successional habitat or managing your timber or preparing food plots, creating new prairie habitat, whatever it is. It's great. It's good to get your hands dirty, get out there on the land and give back. So I'm happy you're doing it. I appreciate it. And until next time, stay wired to hunt.